Our speaker this afternoon will be Eric Erickson, Dr. Eric Erickson. His first name is actually Christopher. But when I looked up Eric Erickson in Google, I found out that that was one of the former kings of Sweden. Yeah, I was surprised to learn that. But our Dr. Christopher Eric Erickson comes from a musical family in England and trained as a biophysicist at Imperial College in London. He's received his PhD from there. And he published medical and scientific research on the properties of bone. He subsequently studied the mystical approach, which involves looking within as well as looking without. He has 2 novels out right now. The first one was Beethoven's 10th Symphony. He was probably listening to the 9th as part of the time when he wrote it. And his new one is Shakespeare and the God Virus. In that, he has not only will he be with us, but he'll also be at the Tucson Book Festival. So you can identify his gray hair and come back and see him on March as well. And I'll just take a minor quote from this. This is, in an affair of the heart, need words be said. My lady is love's teachers. Must book be read. Must books be read. Will approval be mine for my lady's smile, or my words be rejected as meaningless guile? Oh, the mystical sense, the best physicist's sight, please come to my rescue and help me to write. Well, with no further ado, Dr. Eric Erickson to help us write.
Thank you so much. So, you know what, I think I have to go,
Chris, hand him a mic.
oh, yeah, do I need the mic? All right. Did everybody hear without it?
No.
We all have hearing aids.
A good friend of mine in Montreal, when he doesn't want to hear something, he just turns it off. So it's very good. Harmony. That's right, or when. There we go. Okay, so I think I have to take this one too. You don't need that. Okay. Now you see, and that's pretty good. I like that because it's very important. How do we see this? I'm in your way. Excuse me. How do we see this? You know, is this because we've been watching too many Narnia movies? Which I must say I do like. Or I can get very down to earth and tell you how I see this. I see this as a typically American can-do-it attitude, which I think is great. And that's what I've always seen this as. Or of course you could look at it and say, yeah, wishful thinking. Or you could say, you know, in my core, in really who I am, that's who I am. And I better work at finding it. Oh, I see. Well, before the Narnia movies, I actually would have seen that as a typical, since I had a very good American uncle, I saw it as a can-do everything American attitude, which I respect. Now, of course, I look at it now and I go, Aslan. Now, of course, you know, C.S. Lewis wrote this. Now, one thing you didn't mention, which I should mention, is I am an ordained Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox priest. So that's going to color a little bit how you're going to hear me speak. I do like this one. For they conquer who believe they can. Now, in the little notes below, when I was thinking about this and writing this, I found myself thinking, now I'll bet that cat is reciting the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. I thought that was a really neat picture. The other side of this is, and this is going to get us on to a little bit of Shakespeare, by the way. The other way of looking at this is, for they conquer who believe they can, well, the greatest person we can actually conquer is ourselves to change. Would you agree? So I look at that, and there's the spiritual, religious side of me. I mean, you know, I have one foot absolutely solidly in physics and science and medical research and all that, but the other side of me is equally on the spiritual and religious side. And so I look at that, yes, there's a very numerous side to that, of course, but I look at that and think, wow, for they conquer who believe they can. And I think, having tried to work on myself and improve myself, I see it along those lines. Now, how did Shakespeare look at this? Well, if you look at Hamlet, you could probably put that in the expression act as if. Act as, well, you know, if you remember the story of Hamlet, I don't have to go into that, but if you remember a little bit of it, you know, he says here to his mother, he's really pretty cross with his mother, who's got together with his uncle after killing his dad. And he said, very nasty, and he says, well, assume a virtue if you have it not. That monster, custom, who all sense doth eat, of habits devil, he's angel yet in this, that to the use of actions fair and good, he likewise gives a frock, or we can put it on. That aptly is put on. Refrain tonight, and that shall lend a kind of easiness to the next abstinence, the next more easy. So, you know, if you stop doing it once and again and again, it becomes second nature. And that's a way to change what you want to change. Act as if. But it's also a very good Adlerian concept in Alfred Adler's psychology. Now, I'm going to tease you. I'm going to tease you a little bit with Shakespeare. And then we'll see some of the real depth in the man who wrote Shakespeare. As you see, nom de plume, pseudonym, and you'll see why I've put this in. Look at, these are straight facts. Nobody can argue with these facts, whatever they think. No manuscript, no poem, no letter has ever been found by William Shakespeare. Boom, finished, that's it. He had 2 daughters. If you couldn't call them really illiterate, they were borderline illiterate. And yet, Shakespeare wrote King Lear, which is an ancient story in Britain. Certainly didn't begin with Shakespeare. But in King Lear, if you remember, he's going to give his kingdom to the daughter who recites best, you know, her love for her dad. So isn't that interesting? He wrote that, but the daughters are borderline illiterate. A lot of Shakespeare's plays are infused with the knowledge of the aristocracy. It's right up there. William Shakespeare was basically a grain merchant. There's no evidence, even though people talk about it, that he actually attended the local grammar school. There's no evidence. There's no evidence that he actually wrote any of this. These are all facts that everybody would accept. Signatures. Well, he has about, I think the next slide shows this, he has about half a dozen signatures. Not all the same, and yet at that time in England, it was pretty common to have different signatures. Nobody paid much attention. They didn't pay much attention to spelling either. And there are, I think, at least 4 or 5 different spellings of his name. Well, he came, as we all know, from Stratford-upon-Avon, and probably you've all been there, or some of you will have been there. No plague to do with where he grew up. Absolutely not one. And he never even mentions his son, Hamlet, who died at the age of 11, who was a fraternal twin of his daughter Judith. All facts. The knowledge in Shakespeare's plays of medicine and the law is astounding. And I think that word is not an exaggeration, really, at all. How did he get this knowledge? Well, we'll come to that. Number 7, interesting point. Now, while I'm mentioning this, perhaps you've seen the movie Anonymous by a German producer, Roland Emmerich, who lives in LA. And it's all about Shakespeare, and his viewpoint is that the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare. And just to put it in a bit of a context, about 5 years ago, they set up a program, a master's degree program in Shakespeare authorship studies at Brunel University in London. So this is getting quite heated now. Travel. William Shakespeare, the actor and grain merchant, never left England. And yet, a good 1/3 of his plays are centered in Italy or deal with the French court. Isn't that interesting? There were several renovations done to the Shakespeare, to the Stratford Monument. And we'll see, I think it's in the next slide, that shows him with a bag of grain, a sack, in front of him, rather than a quill in his hands. Shakespeare never claimed to have written any of this stuff. He never claimed to have written any of it. His last will and testament says nothing about this. He leaves in his last will and testament his second best bed to his wife. What happened to the first one, we don't know. His death goes unnoticed. He died in 1616. His death goes unnoticed. Now, Dr. William Harvey and Shakespeare. Dr. William Harvey is a very interesting person in terms of Shakespeare because he's credited with the discovery of the circulation of blood. Dr. Harvey did his medical training in the University of Padua, which was probably, I think, from what I've seen, one of the best, if not the best, medical school in Europe.
Where was it?
Padua, University of Padua. And so he comes back to London and practices at Bartholomew Hospital. Now, the circulation of the blood, the first, as far as we know, I checked some of this up with the American Heart Association and the AMA, the first that we know of the circulation of the blood being reported by Dr. Harvey is in his lecture notes to some of his students in London. And if I remember correctly, that is 1618 or 1619. Shakespeare died in 1616. And the literary experts say that Shakespeare wrote nothing after 1612. And yet, you read about the circulation of the blood in several plays of Shakespeare. Coriolanus, Romeo and Juliet, and so it goes on, quite a few of them. And it's not just the circulation of the blood. The knowledge of medicine and the law, by the way, but medicine